Hello, welcome back to my channel for another episode of Cat School. And in this video, we are going to be making step by step Smokey the Siamese cat here. If you're new here, Cat School is my make along where I am teaching you to make all 10 cats from my best-selling pattern pack, and the link to the pattern is in the description. I'm also posting the tutorials in short form on my channel, so you can make along however you wish at your own pace. And we have so far made Maurice the Munchkin cat, and in this video we are going to be making Smokey. Don't forget to subscribe along if you love cats and if you would like to learn to make them with me. So when you print out your digital file, there is an equipment list there which has all the details of exact thread shades you need and all the equipment. And you will also need your pattern printed for Smokey. So I've got that here, and the first thing I'm going to do is just cut that out. So I've cut all my templates out, and you will notice on the pieces they have a little colour code. So that will tell you what colours felt to cut them in and how many pieces as well. So I'm just going to cut those now with my felt, and I will show you how to do so. So I've got my beige felt here, which is for the body piece as marked here, and I'm just going to lay it flat, and then I'm going to lay my piece flat, and I'm just going to use a pen to draw around the pieces. If you prefer, you can pin the pieces and then do them that way. This is my preferred method, as I just find it keeps the felt really nice and flat, and I just find that I get a little bit more of an accurate finish. So I'm just going to draw around this twice for 2 pieces. So now that I've drawn around my felt, I'm just going to cut those out, and I'm just using standard scissors. You can use whatever scissors you want. As long as they're sharp, they will give you a nice finish. That's the good thing about felt. You may like to use some smaller scissors for the more finer bits here. So I'm just going to cut around those, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut slightly on the inside of the pen line, and then that means that when they are cut out you won't see the ink, so that will give you a nice finish. So I'm just going to cut round carefully like this. Now we are making this in real time in this video, but if I speed any bits up, or if you find that I'm working too fast or too slow, please feel free to pause the video as you finish a step if you need to catch up at all. It is for you to do what you will with it, so that it can help you learn to make these cats. So there is one piece, and I'm just going to do the same for the other piece. So I've got my 2 body pieces cut out, and now I have all my smaller pieces that I'm going to cut out with my grey felt. So I'm just going to repeat the same process, draw around them and cut them out. You might need smaller scissors for these bits as they're a little bit fiddly. I've got all my pieces cut out now. I'm just going to put one piece to the side because that will be your back piece. So we don't need that yet until we're stitching it together. And I have the other piece, which is now going to be my front piece. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to place the pieces where they're going to go onto the felt. And when you have the pattern and your instructions, there is a helpful diagram which is labelled with all the pieces and where to position them, but I can show you here as well. So just going to position all the pieces like that. And what I'm going to do now is we want this piece to be one piece so that it's all flat and ready to go, and then we can stitch our face detail onto it. So I'm going to pin all these pieces in place so they're secure by just pinning through both layers like that, and you might find it easier to do this one at a time. So I've got my pieces pinned, and I've also got my grey embroidery floss here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off about 50 centimetres, and I'm just going to separate off one strand. Sorry, there's pen all over my hands. Just going to use one strand and just gently pull it apart. And then I'm going to tie a knot in the end so that it's secure. And I'm going to thread my needle, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring it up, and the knot will then secure that on the inside. And I'm just going to make really small little stitches, just single stitches along the edges of each grey piece. So when I've stitched them, I can then remove the pin, and that is nice and secure, so that when I do my embroidery, I'm just going to move the face over a little bit. When I do my embroidery, then it's going to be, I think it would be nicer that way. It's then just going to be nice and secure when I do my embroidery. So I'm just making little tiny stitches like so. So they don't need to be too close together, because when you embroider the face and all the detail, that will secure them further, because we're going to be stitching it as if it's one piece. But we just want a little bit of security so it's not kind of moving around when we're stitching. It'll just make it a lot easier to do. So I have sewn the ears and face down, and because those are a bit far away, I'm just going to finish my thread on the inside. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and hold the thread as close as possible and just tie a few knots to secure it. And if you kind of hold the thread as you pull the knot, that will help it get really close to the felt. So I'm just going to tie a few on top of each other and trim the thread. And that's how you finish your thread. And then I'm just going to start it in the same way by tying several knots, and then again I'm just going to bring it up through both layers and make some small stitches there to secure the pieces. So I'm just going to do that for the rest of the grey pieces, and I will come back and we will go on to the next step. So my front piece is all stitched together now and the pieces are secure. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go round and check for any bits that are overlapping, and I'm just going to trim those so the edges are really neat, and that will just give you a nice neat finish when you're going to stitch it together. So if you see there's a few bits that are just overlapping slightly, just going to gently trim those. And I'm just going to do this really carefully to make sure that I don't accidentally cut into my stitching. You can see that that bit's quite a lot bigger, so I'm just going to give that a bit of a trim, and you can see it there as well. So that's just going to neaten it up nicely. So we have got our piece ready to go. So the next step is going to be stitching all the detail. So I will come back and we will do that in a second. So we're just going to move on now to doing the detail on Smokey. So we're doing his face, his whiskers, his claws, and all this detail before we stitch him together. So we've got our piece here with all the grey pieces stitched onto, and I'm just going to use a pen and I'm going to gently mark out my face. So I'm just going to draw it on there. Little smile. So that's marked, and what I'm going to use now is some black embroidery floss. So I've got it here, and the same as we did with the grey floss, I'm just going to cut off about 50 centimetres, and this time I'm going to use 2 strands. So embroidery floss is made up of 6 strands, which you can see there. So I'm just going to gently pull off 2, and that will give us a little bit of a thicker line, but it's still thin enough to get some finer detail. So I've just pulled that off, and I'm going to tie a knot in one end and then thread up my needle. So I threaded my needle, and I'm going to start with the face with the eye, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the needle up where I want my eye to start, and I'm just going to make a stitch which will determine the size my eye is. So I'm just using my pen as a guide. I've just made that starting stitch, and what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to continue that, making single stitches next to the original one and just keeping them close together and building them up until the eye is the size I'd like it to be. So I'm going to keep them the same direction and roughly the same size, and that just builds it up to how you want your eye to look. So I think I'm happy with that eye, and I'm just going to repeat the same with the other one. So I'm just making a stitch that's going to determine the size my eye is, and then I'm just making some more stitches close to it, keeping them the same length until the eye is the size that I want it to be. So I've got my eyes, and I'm just going to do the same with the nose but horizontally. So I'm going to make a stitch the width I want my nose to be, and I'm just going to build that up a few times to make my cute little cat nose like that. And then we're going to do the mouth now. So I'm going to do a starting stitch which is going to go into the nose like so, and then I'm going to do another stitch, a really small one, again using my drawn mouth as a guide for this, and the stitch is going to go into the point where the last stitch ended, and then what that does is it makes a continuous line, and that is called a back stitch. This is on quite a small scale, but as you can see I'm making the stitch where I want the stitch to finish and going backwards, which is why it's called a back stitch. And I'm just going to keep doing that for my mouth. So the key is here to make the stitches small, and it might take a little bit of practice, but I think it just adds character to the cat as well. You might like to do your cat grumpy, and I'm just making small stitches into the last point and that's going to give me my nice continuous line. So I think I'm just going to do one more for the edge of the mouth. And there is my smiley kitty. And then I'm just going to do his little whisker spot. So I'm just going to make a few small single stitches each side of the mouth to look like little whisker spots like that. So I have got Smokey's face stitched here, and the next step is I'm going to add some little cheeks. So again, I'm using 2 strands of thread, but I've got my pale pink this time. And like I say, when you download the pattern and the instructions, the exact shades will be shown here. So I'm just going to separate off 2 strands. So I threaded my needle with my pink, and I'm just going to make some small stitches underneath the eyes for little cheeks, and I think that's just nice to make the face stand out a bit more. So I'm, again, like I did with the eye, I'm just making a few stitches close together until I get the cheek the size I want it. And I'll do the same on the other side. Like so. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tie a knot on the back to finish the thread. So what we're going to do now is Smokey's claws here. So again, I've done the same thing to start my thread by tying a knot in one end, and I've got 2 strands again here. And I'm just going to make single stitches, and I'm going to do 3 on each leg or paw. And what I'll need to do is I will need to start the thread. What I will need to do is I will need to end and start the thread between each leg. So I've done those 3, and I'm just going to try and hold the thread as close to the felt as possible and make a few knots just to finish that, and then trim it and start it again in the same way. And I'm just going to repeat that for all the legs. So again, I'm just making 3 stitches. So we're going to do that on all 4 legs, and I will come back when those are done. So I've got my stitched piece here with the paws ready to go, and what we're going to do now is the whiskers. So what we're going to use for this is just 1 strand of embroidery floss in white. So I'm just going to gently separate those, and again, as we're doing, tie a knot in one end of the thread and thread the needle up to start it off. And then for the whiskers, I'm just going to bring my thread up, and I'm just going to make single stitches, and the size of the stitch will determine the length of your whisker. So I'm just going to make those for the finishing touches. So I think I'm going to do 4 on each side. 3 and 4. And then I'll do the same on the other side. And then I'm just going to add the whiskers on the eyes as well. Again with single stitches. I think just 2 there. And then I'm just going to add that on the other side. Like so. And I'm just going to tie the thread in a knot again and finish that off. So I have my stitched piece now and I'm almost ready to sew him together. But what I'm just going to do before I do that is I'm just going to add a last bit of detail, which is these little stitches here. And I think they're just nice to add because it makes the cat look a little bit more textured and it gives kind of a little bit of texture of fur. So I'm just going to try and keep them quite scattered and random. And I'm just going to gently use my pen as a guide to mark that. I think that's enough. And I am using for that 2 strands of my brown thread, which is kind of like a beige. And again, like I say, all these colours are referenced in the instructions. You have a full equipment list in there. And I'm just going to make those with individual stitches where I'm using my pen as a guide. And like I say, don't worry about too much about keeping these two uniform. I think if you think of a cat's fur, it's going to be kind of random and textured and organic, but you can keep it a little bit more scattered. And I think it's fun to just have a bit of an experiment here. So I've just got 2 more there. Like so. So I'm just going to finish my thread off. So that is my stitched front piece, and I will come back in the next step when we will stitch him together. Okay, so we're now ready to stitch Smokey together. So we are going to need our front piece that we've just stitched, and also the back piece that we put to one side. And also think what you might like to do with Smokey when you've made him. So you might be making him as a present. I have made a Maurice into a keychain here, which is really sweet. But all the ones I'm making for cat school, I'm making into tree ornaments like this, because I just think a cat Christmas tree would be incredible. So I'm using the same white ribbon, which is kind of velvet, for all of them. So I have got that here ready, and I've got about 10 centimeters there. So I'm going to fold that in half to make a little loop, and I'm just going to sandwich that between the front and the back, and I'm just going to pin that in place before I stitch Smokey together. So I'm just going to pin that in place so it's sandwiched like that. And you will also find, if you want to do a hanger like that, your pattern piece will be marked with where to put it as well, just so that when you hold it up like this, it will hang evenly and it won't kind of be lopsided. So now we're ready to stitch Smokey together. I've cut off my embroidery floss in the colour closest to the main felt colour, so I'm using this beige. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use 1 strand of that to make the stitching nice and subtle. So I'm just going to pull that off like that and tighten a knot and get the thread ready as we've been doing throughout. So I'm just going to tie the knots and thread the needle. So I'm going to show you my recommended stitch for sewing together, and that is a blanket stitch. So I'm going to start about here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my needle up from the bottom of the top layer, and where I bring my needle up will determine the length of the stitch. So if you want a bigger stitch, you might bring it in further, etc. So I'm going to bring my needle up, and the knot's going to secure it in place, and then I'm just going to tuck that tail on the inside, and I'm going to go over and make my first stitch like that. And before I pull it tight, you will see it will create a little loop, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my thread through the loop like that and pull it tight, and that's my starting stitch. And then I'm just going to repeat that. So again, I'm making my stitch the length I want it to be, pulling pulling it almost tight till I have a loop and bringing that through. And then there we go, that is a blanket stitch. So I'm just going to keep doing that. So let's show you for a little bit. And when you've practiced this a little bit, bringing the thread through the loop will become kind of second nature, and you might be able to do it more so as you go. But I think it's just helpful when you're learning it to visualize that loop like that, because it makes it clear what the stitch is doing then. So that's my blanket stitch, and I'm just going to keep doing that around the edges. And I'm not going to put any stuffing in yet. I will show you when we get to that point how to do that. So I'm just going to keep stitching around, and you might find as you go that the edges aren't quite the same. If the pieces, as long as the edges are matched up, you might have some discrepancies with the pieces being slightly different size, and that just can happen because you're hand making something. But you might just need to trim those to even them out, and do that very carefully to make sure you don't cut your thread. So I'm just going to keep stitching. And if you want to learn how to do the blanket stitch in a bit more detail and get a bit more practice, there is another video just about that on my page. So I'm just going to keep doing the stitching. And I'm going to keep going and come back when I get to my hanger and show you how I stitch through that. So I'm now at the point where I'm ready to stitch through my hanging string, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep stitching through in the same way. My cat's coming to help now. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stitch through. There we go, off she goes. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to stitch through. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to stitch through in the same way, but I'm going to also bring my thread through the centre of the ribbon or the string I'm using, and make a few extra stitches as I go. And that will just make sure, it can be a little bit fiddly to make sure your thread doesn't get caught in the loop, but I'm just going to make sure I consciously stitch through that string a few times, which will just make sure it's nice and secure to hang when I'm finished. I can take that pin out now. So I think I'm just going to do one more. So now that is nice and secure, and what I can do is I can just keep blanket stitching round. And I'm going to go all the way round to the tail. And then I'm going to start popping some stuffing in. My cat's talking to the birds. So I've just got to the end of the tail, and I can see that the layers are a little bit uneven. So as I showed you earlier, I'm just going to gently trim that to make sure it's the same. And that will just make sure I get a nice neat finish when I'm stitched together. So what I'm going to do before my tail is stitched shut is I'm just going to pop a little bit of stuffing in because I'm getting a nice little pocket there, and because it's quite fiddly, if I wait till I get that, it might be a little bit fiddly to get it in. So I've got my stuffing, I've got about a handful, and I'm using just polyester toy stuffing, which you can buy in most craft stores or online. And the trick with stuffing, I find, is that less is more, and you can kind of compact it up slowly, and that will stop it getting lumpy, and it will just keep your animals a lot nicer and soft and squishy. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to gently feed that in using the end of a pen, which will allow me to kind of maneuver it in a little bit. And then when I'm happy with the amount I've got in, I'm just going to keep stitching and do it as a little bit of a process where I stitch a bit, stuff a bit, and just do it by eye as I go. And I'm going to try and keep the fibres out of the edge so that they don't kind of get trapped in my stitching. So you can gently kind of tease them out. And I'm just going to keep stitching round like that. So when I get to about here, I will come back and I will show you how to put a bit more stuffing in. So I've stitched right round to here now, and I've got that opening left. So I'm going to start putting some stuffing in now. And like I said before, I really find that using less is more, particularly on these smaller bits like the feet. So I'm just going to use a really small amount, and then I'm just going to use the end of my pen, and I'm just going to gently tease it in. And I'm just going to gently push it in. And I don't want to do this too hard because that will be what makes it go lumpy. So I'm just going to kind of do it by feel, a little bit by eye, and I'm just going to use about this much at a time and just push it in gently. So that's looking really nice now on the body. And then I'm just going to put a little bit more in the face and the ears. And just do smaller amounts here. You can use the pen to kind of jiggle it in then. Like that. So the face is coming to life as well. And I'm just going to keep pushing it in gently. And again, as I go, I'm going to try and push it out the way of the edges so that when I'm sewing, it doesn't get stuck in the stitching. So I'm just going to keep going round now with my stitching. I'm almost the whole way round now, and I've got that little hole here, so I'm just going to pop a little bit more stuffing just till it's at the level I want it, and then I'm going to finish off the stitching, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So I'm just going to get a last little bit of stuffing, maybe a bit less than that, and I'm just going to pop it into the hole and use my pen again to just push it in gently. And I'm going to use the pen to just try and get as much as the stuffing away from the edge as possible, and that will just give you a really nice finish. And I'm just going to keep doing my blanket stitch until I get to the point where I started the stitching. So I'm just going to keep going. And then I'm going to show you how I finish my stitching off, which may be a bit unconventional, but it works really well for me. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm just going to make several stitches on top of each other where I've finished. And then I'm going to use my needle to push it between the front and the back and bring it up through the centre like that. So you won't see it on the back, it's gone right through the middle. And then that means that there's a bit of a tail on the inside. So that then when I snip my thread, that means it's not going to unravel. There's less chance of it unravelling. And there is your smoky. Please let me know in the comments if this was helpful, if there was anything that you weren't clear on, and don't forget to give it a like if you enjoyed this. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you on the next one.